my book, Bethlehem, the War of Jesus, and Paul's Plan for Peace. My pen name is Shortell. That means bringing light by telling a short story. The purpose of the Bible was to undermine the authority of the temple. And this is done with 7 laws that Jesus proposes. Of course, he had his first 2, which were worship the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and might. And the second, love your neighbor as yourself. These neither had to do with the temple. None of them had to do with the temple. And Jesus' sacrifice itself was all about removing the authority of the temple to continue with their daily sacrifice. The mountain ran with blood. So from the first one, Jerusalem, Jesus said, you say worship in Jerusalem, I say worship in spirit and truth. Again, indirectly taking power away from the temple. The Sabbath, Jesus said, God made the Sabbath for man, not man for the Sabbath. And he goes on to say further about if someone has an ass, this is the Bible, ass falls into a ditch, who would not dig them out, even though it were the Sabbath, is the implication. And that's talking about, again, taking power away from the temple. The temple was also excited about food and what you ate and how that related to God. So Jesus said, what you eat falls through into the sewer, and watch more what comes out of your mouth, because that comes from your heart. And again, you're taking power away from the temple. Education. Jesus was very upset with the lawyers and the scribes. You'll remember that from the Bible. The genealogy. Jesus said, I can take from these stones, he was talking about the desert, these stones, I will raise children unto Abraham. For the clothes, he said, they're ostentatious, you're washing the outside of the bowl. This last one, it's a little bit of a stretch. He's talking about the hair and how long hair is not necessarily a good thing on a man. He's referring to the holy ones, the Sadducees, those that are focused on zealotry and following the law of God. He was saying to basically those folks, they don't cut their hair. They're sort of trying to be like Nazarites, I believe. I'm not Jewish. I'm Catholic, so I couldn't speak to you about the Jewish too much there. But he's talking about the long hair and how that is maybe not necessarily a good thing. But each of these things takes power away from the temple, and it focuses on an authority outside of the temple. And that's kind of what the first purpose of the Bible was. That is a lot to digest. So I'm going to leave that sit with you for a little while. I'm going to go off some other things, and then we'll get to the second major principle of the Bible. So for Paul's plan for peace, again, this is not the second major principle of the Bible, but for Paul's plan for peace, Paul, he came actually before the second purpose of the Bible was written. Paul, his letters, they predate most of the Gospels. They predate the Gospels. So the Gospels come later with the Bible. But Paul's letters are focused on bringing Greeks into the temple. And that comes from the Gospel of John. He's talking about the wine, how he turns the water into wine. And then he goes up and he meets the woman at the well. And she says, hey, this water comes from our great-great-great-grandfather or whatever, Jacob. And he built this well. Are you greater than Jacob? And of course, Jesus gives her another indirect answer, saying basically, there's a bigger context you need to grab a hold of here. Sadducees, these were zealots. These were the temple authority. This was mainstream Judaism. You've got the Sicarii that people say were the zealots. They were the far extremists of the Sadducees that wanted to kill people who spoke in the temple about God without being circumcised. But for the most part, the Sadducees here, they're the zealots. They're the ones that are following the law. The Pharisees, now if you go to the Bible, it says about the Sadducees, they didn't believe in an afterlife. That's not the major issue there. The major issue for the Sadducees is we will follow the law, and we're going to worship at the temple, we're going to be circumcised. The Pharisees, they were from cities. The Pharisees they're essentially Roman. They're outside of the temple. They're not focused on the temple. There were a few people at the temple who were Pharisees. This would be the Sanhedrin. Mark Antony, I'm going to get into that in a bit. Mark Antony down here, when he and Herod took over, they killed the entire Sanhedrin. And then this is like a second temple sort of type Sanhedrin built. And there are a few Pharisees on them. One author says that they needed the authority. The Sanhedrin needed authority, and to get that authority, they needed a few Pharisees on their group of judges. The Essenes, these supposedly peace-loving people, what they were doing is not paying taxes. They're eating stuff that grows of its own in the wild. They're eating locusts and honey like John the Baptist, who was beheaded. They are avoiding taxes. They're avoiding paying Rome its due, so that Rome doesn't get the money to pay for soldiers to come down and kill people in Israel. The Essenes, even though it says they're peaceful, they're not paying taxes. And Rome would happily take an animal. The Essenes, they're vegetarian. The Sicarii, I've already talked about Sicarii. They're the far right wing or the far extreme wing of the Sadducees. They're willing to kill you. They carry the Sicae. It's a knife. Many times the Bible will talk about a sword. We'll get into the destruction of Israel, which is the second major point of the Bible. The Bible is a sword. It is a weapon wielded by Rome to destroy Israel, to kill Israel, wipe out millions of people. 1 million in Israel, 1 million in Egypt. That's according to Robert Eisenberg. This is a specific group in Israel called the Sadducees. These are the people who operate the temple. Now the Herodians, they're above the Sadducees, and they're tied into Rome. So the Herodians in Rome, they're tight. But the Sadducees, these are the regular people of Israel. And you've got a couple other groups. You've got the Essenes and the Sicarii. The Essenes, according to Josephus, are the peaceful folks. But if you look at what they're doing, it's not quite so peaceful. And the Sicarii, of course, they're the violent folks. But they're all together. Josephus started out as a Sadducee. Then he became a Pharisee, and then he was an Essene. Although, by my calculations, he was only an Essene for 4 years. And according to Josephus himself, it was a 7-year initiation. So how he managed that, I'm not quite sure. But apparently his family was rich, and they were well connected, and they were from the temple. They were Sadducees. He was a priest. So maybe you can push things along a little faster sometimes. Josephus was around when James was killed and took a trip to Rome based on that, where he spoke with Poppaea, who was Caesar's wife. Then he came back, became the general over the northern section of Israel, surrendered Galilee essentially, and then worked for the Romans. He said Vespasian was the Messiah, and Vespasian went on to become Caesar. But then Josephus went down to Jerusalem, and for this destruction of Israel thing, the second point of the Bible, Rome killed 1 million people in Israel. Rome killed 1 million people in Egypt. This is pretty much the destruction of Israel and just hopelessness, despair, everything you can imagine. There's just no people left. They took 100,000 people as slaves. So Rome took 100,000 people as slaves. 20,000 of those went to Italy, went to Rome, and were used to build the Colosseum. But basically, all of Israel was wiped out. And this is not talked about in the Bible, and it's one of the major things that the Bible should mention. So after the wiping out of all the people there, the Bible was used as a sword. Carthage was destroyed in the previous century, for 150 BCE roughly. Carthage was destroyed. They sowed its field with salt. The same way, Josephus wrote about, went into the temple, took the books that were there, had the temple burned, managed to blame the Jews for literally burning the temple. This is it's straight destruction. Seneca went to Egypt. Seneca was Caesar's secretary. Went to Egypt, burned the library at Alexandria, took whatever books he thought were valuable, went back to Rome. And Josephus did the same when in the destruction of Israel. Josephus was supported by Epaphroditus. Epaphroditus was Caesar's secretary. Was Caesar's secretary at the time. Epaphroditus also supported Paul. These four people are highly involved in the creation of the Bible. This is Bernice, Drusilla, Mariamne, and Agrippa. Bernice and Drusilla both talk to Paul for the Bible in Acts. They're the ones that come down and try to get Paul not to go back to Jerusalem, but to go on to Rome. And Agrippa, of course, comes in after the fact and advises. It isn't Herod, it's there were two governors like Fatus and Festus. He advises one of those governors to send Paul on to Rome as opposed to sending back to Jerusalem, where of course the Sadducees would kill him. So that's pretty much all I've got to say for now. And I appreciate your time and look forward to having you read my book. Thank you.